Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about startups. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick. Some founders believe that employees from big tech companies are not well suited for startups and should not be hired by them. Do you agree with this? Yes, I do agree with that. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's, the golden rule that applies to everybody because I'm one of those sort of pragmatistic people who believe that everything, context and situations and so forth. Like there are very few absolute rules in the world, and everything is usually on a case by case basis. But as a general thing, I can agree with this to a certain point because basically the thing that differs the most between big tech companies and startups has to do with how much you need. It depends a little bit on business model as well, but big tech companies, they are usually able to provide a lot more funding and therefore more people and process and so forth than the smaller startups and so forth. And so if you are running a smaller startup, especially in the early days, like if you're running a small startup, you really need to have people who are both like they're talented, but they're also the sort of people who just go and do stuff and make it happen and so forth and so forth. And they're very autonomous and ideas. I like to say they're a little bit they have a knack for taking personal responsibility and making sure that they go the extra mile and so forth and so forth, which is not a hard requirement for big tech companies mostly, because in big tech companies usually, I mean, to take a very silly example, they can hire a full-time person to say do the operations, or they can hire a person who just does the scrum meetings or whatever you're doing, right? Smaller startups may not necessarily have the funding to do so, and for startups it's much more important to have very diverse, highly talented software developers than just a software developer. So it's a little bit. I sometimes I don't really envy the startups sometimes because it's almost a paradox where you need top talent, you need the best of the best to make sure that you have the right person who can sort of they can move across technologies, they keep themselves updated, and they can handle all the things that you might throw at them because you simply do not have the time and resources to pamper them in the same way as in the big companies. So you can't really afford to have complacent people or people who really just do this as a job or so forth and so forth in many cases. But at the same time, you may not necessarily be able to pay the same sort of salaries as the big IT companies. And so what I find that most startups are trying to do is, they sell on atmosphere and product ideas and tech stacks and stuff like that. So they're trying to, in many cases, pitch themselves as a cooler, more innovative work environment where you can have a little bit of freedom and you can have a say and stuff like that, which is not necessarily what the big tech companies are able to offer to their employees and so forth. And believe it or not, guys, I've seen many very, very skilled developers who used to work at big tech companies come and like work for startups and stuff like that. But as I said, it really is on a case by case basis. And I have had situations, guys, where I've seen it very clearly that I work, and this can even go for big companies, guys. This is just me now, but my experience from working in both like very small startups and running my own one, and like being part of others and being part of really, really, really large organizations and working with people from all across the world, I can say with certainty that even in a large IT company, you might have a team that operates very much like a startup where you don't have all the resources and like all this pampering I'm talking about, or this extra process and stuff like that. And so you need to take more accountability as a software developer. And I have been very sad to say that I've had some developers who joined teams that I've been part of where, since I know roughly what I need to do and I have all the like I have the width and the knack and so forth for taking responsibilities and making sure that things happen and so forth, because you know how it is to work in a startup, then I can work really well in that team. But they could not. because they are very much accustomed to only having to do the thing that is written on the story card. And that's usually not good enough for, well, a lot of times that's not good enough in a startup. In a startup, you have to be more engaged than that. And so the thing that I would sort of change about this perspective, saying that you shouldn't hire big tech company developers or stuff like that for startups, is that you should not hire people who are only in it for the work, or like startups should not hire people who are just software developers due to money, or like that it's financially stable or something like that. These are not people you want in your startup. You want top talent. You want people who are engaged, who have, as I like to say, a lifestyle. They really enjoy what they do, and they care enough to invest some of their personal time, and like they keep on learning and they keep themselves updated. But the standard tech employee who literally couldn't give a shit about what's going on, like they don't subscribe to any newsletters or anything like that. They're just really there to do whatever their work tasks are, and if it's not on a story card, or if they don't have 20 meetings for clarification, then they're not going to do it, and they're not going to do it well, and so forth. These are not people that you want in your startup, and sadly, as I said, these people are very, very common in large IT companies, and that's why I suspect that these prejudices are there, because in really large IT companies, they have a lot more people, and as you can imagine, it's kind of, well, it's very difficult. Like the larger the scale, the harder it is to quality to control every person who's in that company, especially if they're there for a very long time. They might be really good in the beginning, and then after a few years, they sort of slouch down and don't really care anymore, so forth and so forth, and apathy sets in. These are very common things, and so I do agree that the general sentiment of this is correct. So what I want you to take away from this is that, yes, I agree that big tech company developers are in many cases not suited for startups, but I raise my finger and I say that it's a case by case basis, guys, because as I said, there is very little for you to gain from hiring an individual for a startup, which is a usually much faster moving organization, many more ad hoc things, and so forth and so forth. Because in those environments, you really need top-notch developers to make a successful product. In many cases, it's not always the case, but you need people who are a little bit flexible and a little bit hungry and like take initiative and stuff like that. In large IT companies, not always, but in many cases, you don't need the same sort of people for that. I like to say that I always try to match the right person to the specific thing I'm doing, and that doesn't matter if it's a startup or if it's a big tech company, because as I've said, guys, I've been in teams in large IT companies who literally ran exactly the same way. Like I could not tell the difference between that and what I did in a startup. And we had people who came into that team who had to leave again because like they could simply not take responsibility and be dynamic and flexible and stuff like that. They were really set in, this is how I'm doing stuff, and that's the only thing that I am able to execute on, and so we can't keep them because we need people who are more diverse than that, right? And so for startups, like it's not really all that common. I find that they recruit like people who are very low initiative or have a low interest in the craft. They usually favor trying to hire the hungry people or the people who keep themselves updated and like have, as I said, a lifestyle. Like they are real quote unquote like rock star developers, so they really care and they really keep in touch with the communities and stuff like that. But I mean, the big tech companies, they want these people as well to a certain degree. It's just that they need so many people that it's kind of hard to scale on only those people. And in many cases, it's very difficult for people to figure out what does a really good software developer look like, and what is a person who may not be so suited, and so forth and so forth. And so in general, I agree with this sentiment, but at the same time, I mean, the large IT companies, it's not like they only have those sorts of people. So you really have to, as I've said before, guys, you always have to do the interview. The CV might tell you where people have been working and stuff like that, and if you have a lot of experience with it, you can get some vibes and stuff like that. But you always have to do the interview. And frankly speaking, I've never been able to do a single interview where I could check anything besides the knowledge and get a sense of like the vibe from a person. That's absolutely possible. But when you put them into the company and they actually start doing the work, that's the only when you really see if they can swim in the environment. So when you throw them into a startup, the startup can really only figure out if they can handle the situation after a few months of working there. And the big IT tech companies, they have the same sort of situation, right? And that's why I'm saying that don't treat it as an absolute rule, but there's definitely a grain of truth based on my experience at the very least in this. Have a great day.